With one final bid, he won the storage container he wanted. But the contents could either be a worthy find or it could turn out to be the stuff of nightmares. When a man discovers a locked safe in the storage container he bought, he is ecstatic. It's a find that most can only dream of, but he doesn't expect the police to turn up at his front door hours later. But before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. He was just starting to get comfortable with bidding on storage containers that were on auction. Spending money on stuff like that was a huge gamble, especially when you had no idea what was inside. But he'd heard so many stories about people striking it rich and of people finding classic cars that they used to drive off into the sunset. He hoped the same would happen to him. Up until that point, he had been lucky, managed to sell the contents he found in containers for just a little over what he had paid for the entire lot. But it was a lot of work, and it took a lot of time to go through someone else's junk. Yet he had to sort through it all, clean the valuable things, and then find the right buyer. He was almost at the end of his rope for the day. If there wasn't anything big in the next one, he was done. Joe stood outside the container with about 15 to 20 other people. Everyone was eager to see what was inside the 515 unit. These units were too big to get a good look inside. A unit that size would be ideal for storing furniture like a couch, chair, and even a small dining set. Or they could be used for sporting equipment, bicycles, and business merchandise. It felt good to win. But he had to warn himself, as he had done many times in the past, that he had to stick to his budget. But Joe just couldn't help himself this time around. The container was tightly packed with furniture, which often goes for a good price, especially when it's old, and there were a few other goodies he wanted to look a little closer at. But a woman behind him kept upping his bid. It started at $100. It was a hefty starting bid, but the container was really full. He matched the bet, and then the woman upped it a little. He bet a bit more, and so it continued. How long could it possibly go on for? He was $350 in, and he was adamant. There was no way he'd give up the container. The bets rose to $400, and she still hadn't given up, but neither had he. The bets kept climbing: $450, $460, $470. It felt incredible, but at the same time, he was shaking. All but a few onlookers moved away from the site now that Joe was victorious. They had lost interest in the contents since they weren't the ones that had to go through it. But once they saw what he found, they could only wish they had been the ones to win it. Joe slowly walked into the large unit, afraid and thrilled about what he would stumble upon. The container was packed with old furniture, but there was a bit of a gap that allowed him to walk between the items. There had to be something better in there that would help him break even, so he began looking. Joe's eyes flitted over the room and quickly fell on a dull gray container that was lying on the floor next to a chest of drawers. He rushed over and immediately set about opening it, but there was yet another problem. The safe he discovered was locked. With the hope that it held something worthy, Joe called up one of his friends and asked him to come over and bring a drill. Joe drilled deep into the lock to force it open. When he finally broke through, he carefully took the lid off. Joe was surprised to see a collection of old VHS tapes and got to his feet and started to pull them out. Underneath the tapes was a note, but when he read it, a chill went up his spine. The note simply read, "Don't," in rough handwriting. Joe inspected the old videotapes one by one and noticed that some were dated, but there was no other information written on the labels. He suddenly had the feeling that he was being watched. He turned to look behind him, but he was all alone in the storage container. You see, all things were not going to be peaches and cream for Joe and his extraordinary find. Barely 2 hours into his discovery, there was a knock on the door and soon men in uniforms were swarming all over the container. Joe's elation was short-lived. Just what had he gotten himself involved in? The safe was stuffed with bundles of yellowed wax paper. Joe carefully unwrapped the first bundle and was astonished to find $50 bills. Joe couldn't believe his eyes as he unwrapped parcel after parcel after parcel. He had never seen so much money. But just how much money was there? Who did it belong to? And why were the authorities so interested? were the atwoordem Hewitzerborstheketchiens. By den arrest of instijdevichers the perspoikers staus. But Joe realized that in his exultation he had sent photos to his girlfriend and also uploaded the photos of the contents of the safe to pretty much every social media site. Or statistics of his social media accounts, as shown by the follow-meter app he used, even showed that his followers had increased, no doubt trying to get some of his cash. No wonder the police were here. Well, he still hadn't been able to count all the cash, but he knew it was enough to roll in. So far, he was up to $1 million. He dragged himself away to talk to one of the officers waiting for him. But as Joe would soon find out, the police weren't the only ones interested in the contents of the safe. All in all, there was $7.5 million stashed away in a few safes around the containers. Everything from nickels to $100 bills and pink slips for cars. There was just one gigantic problem. The original owner had gotten wind of the find and had hired some top-notch lawyers to get back his fortune. Joe was in trouble. Almost as soon as Joe had found the huge amount of cash, he started to receive threats and things started to take a frightening turn. Everything started moving extremely quickly after the police arrived. Soon after, Joe got a call from the lawyers telling him in no uncertain terms that he must return the money, but that he could keep $600,000 as a finder's fee. Joe had been told in no uncertain terms to leave everything as he had found it until the case wound up, but a man's curiosity could only be kept at bay for so long. He had to know what was on the tapes. One sleepless night, he carefully opened the plastic bag they had been sealed in, popped one into an old VCR and pressed play. As Joe tells it, he witnessed something that made his blood run cold on those tapes, and now that he had watched them, he could never unsee them again. Joe wrestled with a dilemma. If the owner of the safe knew that the tapes had been found, would they come after him? Should he just keep quiet? Did they already know he had seen them? Night after sleepless night, the images plagued him. So, what had he seen on the tapes? After consulting with his friends, Joe learned that in the state of California, once a unit had been sold, the contents were no longer owned by the delinquent tenant. He had full rights to keep anything in the unit. After all, he had purchased it fair and square, but the lawyers were not going to back down that easily. Thinking that they were doing Joe a service, they upped the finder's fee to $1,200,000 and they were playing hardball. Who knew what these people were capable of? Joe began wondering just how someone forgets $7.5 million in a delinquent storage rental. So would he only get $1.2 million? That's a huge amount of money in anyone's book, but still not quite like the huge figure that he had just felt in his hands while unpacking wad after wad of money. He didn't like the fact that he was being strong-armed, but there was also the moral dilemma. It was now his money, but he didn't do a thing to earn it. Perhaps he should give it back. The thought was not sitting well with him. After much deliberation and death threats, Joe decided that splitting the money straight down the middle would be a fair split. After all, the now previous owners had left the container unpaid for a lot more than a couple of months, in fact. Almost a year without responding to the letters sent by the store owners, and that debt was exactly why the auction had happened. Self-storage is almost identical to the real estate industry and works the same way as apartment buildings or longer-term rental hotels. The storage owners rent or lease storage units to their tenants who pay their fees by the day, week, month, or year. And just like an apartment building, tenants who stop paying the rates for the rental must be dealt with by the storage facility. If a storage facility landlord's tenant stops paying for the storage unit, the landlord can try to deal with them in two ways. They can evict the non-paying tenant, and if that doesn't rectify the situation, they can eventually auction off the tenant's items to recover their costs. Although this may seem unfair, storage facilities operate on extremely fine margins. A storage owner says, "I really don't make much money out of auctions, it's to try to cover our expenses. 90% of the time I don't cover my losses. One unit may have cost me $600 and the person bids at $400, so my revenue has still suffered a loss.